Hello, my darlings, and welcome to 24 Days of Advent Adventure. Today is day 16, and today's story is called Christmas Game by Susan Price. It was written in 1993, 31 years ago, when I was 17 years old. You think you know Christmas? You think you know Krampus? You think you know Father Christmas? No, you don't. David's mum has been invited to a Christmas party at the neighbour's house at number 42. David wants his mum to go so he can have some time to himself because, after all, he's a teenager. He's got homework to do. It's Christmas Eve. He never really feels very Christmassy. And he just wants to have some time on his own. He wants to do his homework. He has a problem though. A big problem. He's called Kenny. Oh my goodness me, Kenny is a nightmare. He is 6 years old and the child from hell. He is just awful. So David is going to teach Kenny the true meaning of terror and Christmas. He didn't think he could get the two to go together. Well, in this story, in Christmas Games, evil has a new face, and it's not Santa. No, it's very, very not Santa. Are you going to be all right? June said. Yes, Mum. David wished she would just go. And you know where I'm going to be? He folded his arms and leaned on the banister. Just across the road at number 42. I wrote down their number, didn't I? By the phone. If anything's wrong, just ring or come and fetch me. You don't mind me going, do you? No, Mum. I wish you could come as well. It seems a shame you being stuck here, but they haven't invited children, so that's... Mum, if they'd invited me, you couldn't go. Would stay with Kenny. That's true. She paused a moment and then started up again. I wouldn't go, but... David sighed and tipped back his head, closing his eyes. You're too old, aren't you, to care about Christmas Eve? And Kenny's in bed, and it was so kind of them to ask me. You don't mind, do you? Eyes closed, head leaning against the stair rail, he said, just go. I wonder if I should go and check on Kenny. She set one foot on the bottom stair, and David's head snapped down. No, you might wake him, and he's been a real pest all day. He's excited, David. It's Christmas Eve, and he's only little. He didn't have to draw in my book. Oh, your teacher'll understand. Don't make such a fuss. David pushed himself away from the banister, turned and went back into the living room. Kenny had drawn bright crayon pictures of Santa Claus and his reindeer across 4 pages of his history book. His teacher would not understand. 4 pages of his exercise book that he couldn't use, and books had to last the whole year. It wasn't even as if he got on well with his history teacher. It would be, you should look after your things better, Rose. Then you wouldn't have to make excuses. His mother was always the same. Kenny was let off no matter what he did. David always had to stop making a fuss. He had work to do, but he couldn't settle to it until he knew his mother was out of the house. And he hadn't heard the front door slam yet. She'd probably gone upstairs to check on darling Kenny. He sat in the armchair by the fire, on the edge of the seat, waiting, with gritted teeth, for her to get out. Timmy got up from the hearthrug with a grunt, reared up and put warm hard paws on David's knees. Without thinking, David's hand went to Timmy's head, but then he pushed the dog away. Timmy wasn't his. He belonged to the next door's neighbours, who had gone away to Portugal for Christmas, and dumped the snappy little cake hound on the Roses. Mrs. Rose couldn't say no, and David was stuck with having to take the thing for walks. For days now he'd been resisting the little terrier's wagging tail and white grin. There was no point in getting fond of him. He'd go back to his owners in a few days. He heard the front door slam as his mother left for her party at last, and he grimaced. He was glad for her. She didn't get out much, and she'd been so obviously pleased at being invited that she'd seemed younger than him. She'd come and shown him how she looked in her best frock, with her face made up and her hair styled, and had blushed and been embarrassed when he'd said she'd look nice. He'd been telling the truth when he'd said that he didn't mind her going to the party, even though he had to stay at home and do schoolwork. It was just the way she went on and kept fussing about Kenny that irritated him. Kenny had put out a mince pie and a glass of sherry for Santa Claus. He'd hung up his stocking, and he'd gone off to bed quite happy, after a day of making a nuisance of himself. There'd been no need to check on him half a dozen times. He got up and went back to the table where his books were spread out. Economics. Who wanted to be doing economics on Christmas Eve? He slumped in his chair and looked across at the tree in the corner, draped with tinsel and hung with globes. The mantelpiece was cluttered with cards, and at the other end of the table stood the sherry and a mince pie for Santa Claus, all set out very elegantly. Kenny had used one of his mother's best china plates and one of her best glasses, and it was all standing on an embroidered tray cloth. Still, it didn't seem like Christmas Eve to David, just another day with homework to be done. He picked up his pen and made himself write another sentence in his essay. Then he drank the sherry and ate the mince pie and made himself look through some pages of textbooks. Timmy stretched and sighed on the hearth. David took an hour off to watch television, dragged himself back to his books, and managed to write another paragraph, and then, exhausted, lay on his back on the floor, staring at the Christmas tree, until the spangles and brightness blurred in his eyes. The evening crawled by. 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock. His mother still didn't come home. It must have been a good party. It was getting on for midnight when the door of the front room opened, and he looked up, expecting his mother, though he hadn't heard her key in the lock. No one came in, but he was looking too high. As the door continued to open, he looked lower down and saw Kenny in his pyjamas. "What are you doing out of bed?" "Santa Claus hasn't been," Kenny said. "There's no presents." It irritated David that Kenny could still believe in Santa. "It isn't morning yet, dope. Get back to bed." "It is morning. I've been asleep." David got up from the table. "Just because you've been asleep doesn't mean it's morning. Bed." Kenny caught sight of the empty plate and glass, and his mouth and eyes opened wide. "He has been. He ate his pie." "I ate it," said David. "You've got to get back to bed." Kenny was shocked and outraged. You ate Santa Claus's pie? If you don't go back to bed, Santa Claus won't come here at all. Look, if I let you put another pie and another glass, will you go to bed then? Kenny stuck his fingers in his mouth, stared at David, and made an noise, which might have been an agreement. So David went into the kitchen to fetch the tin of mince pies and the bottle of sherry. Kenny left off, stroking Timmy, and cried, I want to do it, soon as David came into the room. OK. David put the tin and the bottle on the table and dragged a chair close. He lifted Kenny up onto the chair and opened the tin for him. Carefully, as if it was an enormously difficult and important operation, Kenny took a pie from the tin and placed it in the very centre of the china plate. He sucked the sugar off his fingers. Now the wine, he said. Give me a chance. David replaced the lid on the tin and unscrewed the top off the bottle. Let me help you hold it. He supported the weight of the bottle while Kenny grasped its neck and guided the mouth more or less over the glass. Brown sherry splashed out. Careful, David said, but some sherry splashed on the white tray cloth anyway. Kenny didn't seem to notice and grinned with pride as David put the top back on the bottle. Can I have a pie? If you take it to bed with you, David said. Give me a pie. David took the lid off the tin again and allowed Kenny to take a pie. Now bed. Kenny seated himself on a chair and bit into the pie. I want to stop up and see Santa Claus come. You promised you'd go to bed. Didn't, Kenny said. Mum put you to bed. She'll be mad if she comes home and finds you up. Don't care, Kenny said. You will. Shan't, Kenny said. He stuffed the last of the pie into his mouth and jumped down from the chair, heading for Timmy on the hearth. Oh no, David said and grabbed him. Let him start playing with the dog and there'd be no getting him to bed. Kenny immediately began to shriek with fury, screams that made David wince. He threw himself down on the carpet, letting his whole weight drag on David's arms. I'll tell Mum! I'll tell Mum! The child cried. Tell her what? It was amazing how heavy Kenny could make himself and how many arms and legs he seemed to have to kick and punch with. I'll tell her you hit me and you were cruel to me, and their mother would probably believe him. David's shoe slipped on the carpet and he fell, banging his elbow hard on the floor. Kenny landed on top of him, and that hurt too. And the dog, Timmy, came dancing round them, barking. David lost his temper. All right, stay up. You'll fall asleep on the floor before I put you to bed. Shan't, said Kenny, all tears gone, and crawled off to David and over to the hearth, all smiles and ready to play with Timmy. Kenny's smugness was infuriating. The brat had got his own way again. Stay up until Santa Claus comes, David said. You'll be sorry. You wish you hadn't. Shan't, said Kenny. David picked himself up and found himself standing close by the tree. A little figure of Santa Claus with a red coat of cardboard and a white beard of cotton wool hung from a branch. He pulled it down from the tree, sending a shower of rustling dry needles down onto the carpet. And jingling the globes together, his anger extended to Santa Claus. He'd always been irritated by that fat, old, smirking, red-faced, boozy chimney climber. You think it's Santa Claus who's going to come, don't you? A nice, kind old man with toys in a sack, but it won't be. Oh, no. Who will it be then? Kenny asked. Father Christmas, that's who. Kenny stared at him for a moment, but then looked away and stroked Timmy. Same thing. No, David said. No, not the same thing. That's Santa Claus. He threw the tree ornament down by Kenny and stepped over him and the dog to take a card from the mantelpiece. That's Father Christmas. The picture on the card wasn't the usual bright Christmassy card picture. It showed a gloomy room with a laughing giant seated at its centre on a heap of food, pies and cakes and Christmas puddings and little barrels. There were dead animals too, hares, little pigs and pheasants. The giant's bare feet rested among them. In one hand he held up a burning stick, and in the other a large cup from which wine was spilling. His long robe of dark green, trimmed with white fur, he had a beard, but it was a dark one, and long dark hair fell to his shoulders. His head was crowned by a wreath of green holly leaves and red berries. That's not Father Christmas, Kenny said. Where's his sack? Santa Claus's coat is red, not green, and his beard's white. That shows how little you know, David said. Father Christmas and Santa Claus aren't the same thing. Completely different. Not, Kenny said, but David could see he wasn't sure of himself. After a whole day of the little pest making his life difficult, that was something. Father Christmas came first, David said. Santa Claus is nothing. He was invented for Coca-Cola. Advert not so long ago, only about 60 years ago. That's a long time, Kenny said. It is to you, because you're only 6. Nearly 7. Only 6. So you know nothing. Santa Claus and his red coat and his white beard, that's just an advert. Father Christmas is much older, ever so old. David made his voice as sinister as he could. He was old before people ever heard of Jesus and started having Christmas. Why is he called Father Christmas then? Kenny asked. He wasn't always. He was only called that after people started believing in Jesus and having Christmases. Before that, he was called. He groped into his memory of the newspaper article he'd read the day before. One of those seasonal pieces about Christmas customs. He's called Wotan. He had Kenny's full attention now. Wotan? Wotan, god of the dead, David said. Dead? Kenny almost choked. He was afraid of ghosts and skeletons and didn't like to talk of the dead. Oh, he had his good side. David paused. He hadn't read the article carefully, and it hadn't made that much sense. He brought good luck to some people, but he wasn't all goody-goody. He was the god of the dead. He lived underground with the dead, and at night, at dark of night. Shut up, Kenny said. You shouldn't say things like this. You'll frighten me. Chicken, David said. Listen, at deep dark of night, when the wind's howling. I'll tell Mum you frightened me. Oh, like I hit you and was cruel to you. Wotan comes riding through the dark on his wild steed. with his ravening dogs and their eyes all glowing like fires. "Shut up!" Kenny said, trembling into tears, and struck out at him. David caught his hand and held it. He'd keep it up until the little brat was crying properly, he thought, and then leave off. It'd teach the little pest not to be such a pain. You know what he hunts? You know what Wotan hunts? Ghosts. All the lost souls who died that year, all wailing and sobbing as they run from Wotan, and his headless hounds that have flames burning where their heads should be. Kenny was crying outright now, snivelling, his small frame shaking, as David held him between his hands. And if you stay up to see Father Christmas come, like a naughty little boy, that's who'll come, the real Father Christmas. Wotan, he'll come looking for souls, for your soul. And that's where we'll leave it. Oh, David, I know you wanted to teach Kenny a lesson. But you're going to get a lesson too, David. A lesson that you're not going to like. Because Wotan wants to cut a deal with you, doesn't he, David? Kenny's soul. But what does he want in exchange for Kenny's soul? Sometimes things too pricey. And deals should never be made. Well, my darlings, if you like Day 16, Christmas Game by Susan Price, give me a thumbs up. And if you really liked it, you can always give me a follow. And come back tomorrow for Day 17 for goodness knows what. I haven't decided yet. Happy readings, darlings, and enjoy. It'll soon be Christmas. Look out for Santa.